Hey guys! Tonight, the Golden Debut, a lavish introduction to the glittering world of Fifth Avenue. The year was 1892, and for Clara Huntington, the world was a cage made of 24-karat gold. Outside the towering limestone walls of the Huntington Mansion on Fifth Avenue, the carriage wheels of New York's elite crunched against the freshly fallen snow. But inside, the air was a heavy, suffocating blend of hothouse lilies, expensive French perfume, and the metallic tang of polished silver. Tonight was the night Clara had been groomed for since the moment she could walk, her formal debut into the 400, the exclusive circle of New York society where a single wrong step could result in a lifetime of exile. Clara stood before a floor-to-ceiling pier glass in her dressing room. Her breath came in shallow, disciplined sips. Her corset, a masterpiece of whalebone and agony, had been cinched so tight by two gasping ladies' maids that she felt her ribs protesting against her lungs. "Tighter, Marie," her mother's voice rang out. Mrs. Althea Huntington stood by the door, draped in midnight blue velvet that cost more than a common laborer earned in a decade. She didn't look at her daughter's face, she looked at the silhouette. "We cannot have a single wrinkle in the Worth gown. Tonight you are not a girl, you are a Huntington. You are the visual manifestation of your father's success in the railroad industry." "I can barely breathe, Mother," Clara whispered. Her voice sounded thin, like a reed in the wind. "Breathing is a luxury for the common folk, Clara. For us, appearance is the only reality." As the maids fastened a triple strand of South Sea pearls around Clara's throat, the weight of the gems felt like a leaden yoke. The gown itself was a marvel of the Gilded Age, ivory silk satin embroidered with thousands of tiny seed pearls and silver thread that shimmered like moonlight on a frozen lake. It was a dress designed to broadcast wealth, to scream to every Vanderbilt and Astor in attendance that the Huntingtons had arrived, and they had more gold than they knew how to spend. Downstairs, the ballroom was a cathedral of excess. 2,000 calla lilies had been shipped from the south via private rail car, lining the grand staircase in a funeral white procession of beauty. Above, the great crystal chandeliers, outfitted with the new, dazzling electric bulbs that flickered with a raw, unnatural light, cast a brilliance that made the diamonds on the guests' necks look like fallen stars. Clara took her place at the top of the staircase. Her father, Silas Huntington, stood beside her. His face was a mask of stern triumph. Silas was a man who had clawed his way out of the coal dust of Pennsylvania to become a titan of industry, and tonight his daughter's debut was his ultimate victory lap. "Smile, Clara," his lips barely moving. "Each of these men in the room owns a piece of the country, but by the end of the night, they will all want a piece of you." The orchestra began the first notes of a Strauss waltz. The sound swelled, filling the cavernous room with a melody that was both graceful and predatory. As Clara descended the stairs, her silk train hissing against the marble, she felt the collective gaze of New York turn toward her. It was a physical heat, hundreds of eyes calculating her dowry, judging her posture, and weighing her worth as if she were a prize mare at an auction. She was introduced to the matriarchs first. Mrs. Astor sat in her velvet chair like a queen on a throne, her black prince diamond glinting on her forehead. Clara curtsied, low, steady, perfect. She had practiced this movement for 3 hours a day for the past 6 months. "A lovely girl, Silas," Mrs. Astor remarked, her voice as cold as a mountain stream. "Can she hold a conversation as well as she holds a fan?" "She speaks fluent French and Italian, ma'am," Althea Huntington interjected, stepping forward with a practiced smile. and her piano compositions have been praised by the finest tutors in Europe. Clara remained silent, a living doll in a world of master puppeteers. She was whirled from one dance partner to the next, young men with slicked-back hair and names like Livingston, Winthrop, and Belmont. They smelled of cigars and imported brandy, but they never looked her in the eye. They looked at the pearls, they looked at the Huntington name. By midnight, the heat in the ballroom had become oppressive. The gilded cage was starting to feel less like a metaphor and more like a tomb. Clara managed to slip away toward the conservatory, a glass-domed wing filled with exotic ferns and humid air. For a moment, the music was muffled, and the frantic energy of the ballroom faded into a dull hum. She leaned against a cold stone pillar, her head spinning. "It's quite a spectacle, isn't it?" a voice drifted from the shadows. Clara startled, pulling her lace fan up as a shield. Out of the darkness stepped a man she didn't recognize. He was older, perhaps in his 30s, with eyes that seemed tired of the very opulence that surrounded them. "I am Arthur Vance," he said, bowing slightly, "a friend of your father's, or rather a business associate." "Mr. Vance," Clara replied, recovering her poise, "are you not enjoying the festivities? My father spent $40,000 on the floral arrangements alone." Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The flowers are beautiful, Miss Huntington, but they are already dying. That is the trouble with the Gilded Age. Everything is cut at the root to decorate a single night of vanity." Clara felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air. That is a very grim perspective to offer a debutante on her first night. "Perhaps," Vance said, stepping closer, "but look at them out there. They dance on the edge of a precipice. The markets are volatile, the labor unions are screaming at the gates, and yet here we are, drinking champagne out of crystal flutes. Tell me, Clara, if the music stopped tomorrow and the gold vanished, who would you be?" Clara opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. The question was a heresy. In her world, the gold was who you were. There was no Clara without the Huntington name, the Worth gowns, and the Fifth Avenue address. Before she could respond, her mother appeared at the entrance of the conservatory, her eyes flashing with a mix of anxiety and irritation. "Clara, the Duke of Manchester is asking for a dance. You cannot be seen hiding in the shrubbery with a— Mr. Vance, I believe you have business to discuss with my husband in the library later. This is not the time." Vance bowed again, his eyes lingering on Clara for a second too long. "Of course, Mrs. Huntington, forgive the intrusion." As Clara was swept back into the light of the ballroom, the Duke, a pale, spindly man with a fading English title and a desperate need for American cash, took her hand. The waltz resumed. The room spun in a blur of white and gold. But as she moved, Clara couldn't shake the image Vance planted in her mind, the image of the cut flowers. She looked at the thousands of lilies lining the walls, beautiful, white and fragrant. They were indeed dying. They had no roots. They were held upright by wire and water, destined to be thrown into the ash heap by dawn.
She looked at her father, who was laughing loudly with a group of bankers. She looked at her mother, who was surveying the room like a general on a battlefield. Everything was perfect. The Huntington debut was the triumph of the season. Yet, for the first time in her life, Clara felt the thinness of the ice beneath her feet. She was an heiress of the Gilded Age. She was the jewel of Fifth Avenue. And she was, as the music reached a crescendo, beginning to realize that every ballroom has an exit, and every fortune has an end. The rigid social hierarchy of the 400 and the cost of maintaining a reputation. The morning after the debut did not begin with rest, it began with the ledger. Clara Huntington sat in the morning room, the pale winter sun filtering through heavy silk drapes. Before her sat a silver tray piled high with calling cards, small engraved slips of pasteboard that served as the ammunition of social warfare. In the Gilded Age, your life was not measured by your pulse, but by whose parlor you were permitted to enter. Her mother, Althea, sat across from her, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose. She was meticulously sorting the cards into two piles, the acceptable and the peripheral. "Mrs. Van Allen has left a card with a folded corner," Althea remarked, her voice clipped and clinical. "That means she came in person. A victory, Clara. But look here, Mrs. Fish has only sent a servant with hers. We are still on probation." Clara watched her mother's hands. They were steady, but the skin was tight over her knuckles. To the outside world, the Huntingtons were invincible, but inside the house, the atmosphere was one of constant, grinding vigilance. To be part of the 400, the elite list curated by Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister, was to live in a state of permanent audition. One wrong guest at a dinner party, one gown worn twice in the same month, or one scandalous whisper could result in a social death more permanent than any physical passing. "Is it always like this?" Clara asked, tracing the embossed gold lettering on an envelope. "Must every gesture be a calculation?" "It is the cost of the crown, Clara," Althea replied, not looking up. "Your father builds the railroads, I build the reputation. Without the second, the first is merely vulgarity. People like the Astors tolerate our money only because we prove we can spend it with their level of discipline." The discipline Althea spoke of was most physically embodied in the ritual of the morning dressing. Later that afternoon, as Clara prepared for a series of at-home visits, she was once again subjected to the corset. This time it was a daily walking corset, stiff, unyielding, and designed to force the spine into a regal, if agonizing, arch. "The silhouette is the social contract," the head maid whispered as she pulled the laces. Clara gripped the bedpost. She felt her internal organs shift. A dull ache began at the base of her spine and radiated upward. This was the literal tightening of her world. The corset was not just a garment, it was a symbol of the Victorian woman's restraint. A lady did not slouch, she did not breathe deeply, she did not exhibit passion, she was a statue of propriety. The curmudgeons of the era, the elderly gatekeepers of old New York, watched for any sign of new money sloppiness. These were the women who had inherited their wealth from Dutch patrons and shipping magnates from a century ago. They despised the nouveau riche Huntingtons with their flashy electric lights and their loud steamships. To them, Althea Huntington was an interloper, and Clara was merely a pawn to be scrutinized. By 4 p.m., the Huntington carriage, a dark maroon brougham with silver-plated lamps, was rolling down Fifth Avenue. The social hierarchy was visible in the very stones of the street. As they passed the sprawling chateaux of the Vanderbilts, Althea whispered the history of every feud. There, she pointed, to a neo-Gothic mansion. The woman there tried to outshine Mrs. Astor by wearing a tiara to an afternoon tea. She hasn't been invited to a ball in 3 years. And there, the Belmonts, they have talent, but they are too loud. Remember, Clara, a Huntington is heard only when she speaks, and she speaks only when the topic is safe. Their destination was the parlor of Mrs. Carolyn Sherman-Horn Astor, the undisputed Queen of New York. The Astor residence was a fortress of tradition. The air inside was colder than the street, smelling of ancient wood and beeswax. Clara felt the eyes of the portraits on the walls, generations of stern, unsmiling ancestors who seemed to demand a pedigree she didn't fully possess. In the parlor, a dozen women sat in a circle of velvet chairs. The silence was heavy, broken only by the delicate clink of bone china and the occasional sharp tisk of a tongue. This was the inner sanctum. "Tell me, Miss Huntington," a woman with a face like crumpled parchment said. It was Lady Beaumont, a curmudgeon of the highest order. "I heard your father is extending his line into the Western territories. Is it true he employs immigrants for the labor?" The room went still. It was a trap. Any defense of her father's business would be seen as shop talk, which was considered vulgar. Any denial would be a lie. Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but the corset held her upright, preventing her from fidgeting. "My father employs those who are willing to build the future of America, Lady Beaumont. He finds that ambition is a trait that transcends borders." A faint murmur went around the room. Althea shot Clara a warning glance. "Ambition," Mrs. Astor said, finally speaking, "is a very dangerous word for a young woman. It often leads to a lack of contentment." "Contentment is for those who have already arrived, ma'am. For those of us still traveling, there is only the road ahead." The drive home was silent for 10 blocks. "You were too bold," Althea said finally, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You do not trade barbs with the Astors. You endure them." "I am tired of enduring, Mother. I am tired of the weight of the pearls and the tightness of the laces." "Then you are tired of your life," Althea snapped. "Do you know what it costs to maintain this house? To keep the servants in livery? To keep the carriage horses shod in the finest iron? It costs your soul, Clara. Every day we pay for our place in this world with our silence and our smiles. If you falter, the bank will notice, and if the bank notices, the world will pounce." As the carriage pulled up to the Huntington mansion, Clara looked at the massive structure. It was beautiful, yes, but it was a factory of reputation. Every brick was laid with the intent to intimidate. She went to her room and signaled for the maid to unlace her. As the corset loosened and the air finally rushed back into her lungs, Clara didn't feel relief. She felt a sudden sharp pang of fear. She realized that the curmudgeons in the parlor weren't just judgmental old women. They were the guardians of a vanishing world. And her father, with his railroads and his ambition, was gambling everything on the idea that the gold would never run out. But as she looked out at the lights of Fifth Avenue, she remembered Arthur Vance's words from the night before. What happens when the music stops? The cost of a reputation was high, but as Clara lay in the dark, she began to wonder if the price of losing it might be even higher. The hierarchy of the 400 was a ladder of glass, glittering, sharp, and incredibly easy to shatter. Tonight, she was still at the top, but for the first time, she felt the wind blowing from the abyss below. A strategic alliance, trading American new money for European old titles. By the spring of 1893, the air in New York had shifted. It was no longer merely cold, it was predatory. The Huntington Ballroom had seen its share of debuts, but the season had now entered its most ruthless phase, the international marriage market. For the nouveau riche of America, wealth was a tool, but for the crumbling aristocracy of Europe, wealth was a lifeline. It was a simple, brutal trade, the exchange of raw American cash for the prestige of an ancient, dusty title. Clara Huntington sat in the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound books she was rarely expected to read. Across from her sat her father, Silas, whose cigar smoke curled toward the ceiling like a dark omen. "The Duke of Southshire is arriving on the Cunard liner next Tuesday," Silas said, tapping a finger on a heavy cream-colored parchment. "He has 30,000 acres in England, a castle that dates back to the Tudors, and a lineage that goes back to the Crusades." Clara looked at the portrait of the Duke included in the folder. He was a man with watery eyes and a chin that seemed to be retreating from his face in apology. He also, according to the papers, has a roof that is collapsing and a gambling debt that exceeds his annual income. Precisely, Silas grunted, a thin smile touching his lips. You will be a duchess, Clara. You will walk into rooms in London and Paris, and women who wouldn't look at me will be forced to curtsy to you. That is the dividend I expect from this investment. An investment, Clara whispered. Is that all I am now? A merger of two failing firms? Silas leaned forward, his eyes hardening into the flints that had broken the backs of labor unions. In this world, everything is a merger. Your mother and I have spent $500,000 this season alone to put you in this position. Do not mistake a parent's ambition for a daughter's hobby. You are the bridge, Clara. You are how the Huntington name becomes immortal. The official market opened 3 nights later at a dinner party hosted by the Vanderbilts. The dining table was a 70-foot stretch of mahogany, draped in lace so fine it looked like spider webs. In the center, a miniature river had been constructed, complete with tiny floating swans and real lilies. It was a display of wealth so grotesque it felt almost violent, yet the guests ate their roasted pheasant as if it were nothing. Clara was seated between the Duke of Southshire and a young count from Prussia. The Duke, whose name was Lord Arthur Penhaligon, smelled faintly of mothballs and gin. I am told, the Duke began, his voice a high-pitched aristocratic wheeze, that your father's trains run all the way to the Pacific. It must be quite loud, all that steam and iron. It is the sound of progress, Your Grace, Clara replied, her voice as polished as the silver in her hand. Though I suppose progress is a noise one hears less frequently in the ruins of a Tudor estate. The table went silent for a heartbeat. Althea Huntington, sitting 3 seats down, went pale, but the Duke merely chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Spirited, the Duke remarked, turning to Silas. I like a girl with a bit of steel in her. It makes the breaking of the spirit so much more rewarding. Clara felt a chill run down her spine that the heavy velvet drapes could not block out. She looked around the table. She saw other girls her age, Mary, Gladys, Consuelo, all sitting with their respective titles. They were the dollar princesses. They were being sold across the Atlantic to fix leaky roofs, pay off mistresses, and prop up a dying feudal system. And in return, their fathers would get a coat of arms to paint on their carriage doors. After dinner, the men retreated to the smoking room to discuss the dowry, the true heart of the negotiation. Clara sat in the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound books she was rarely expected to read. Across from her sat her father, Silas, whose cigar smoke curled toward the ceiling like a dark omen. The Duke of Southshire is arriving on the Cunard liner next Tuesday, Silas said, tapping a finger on a heavy cream-colored parchment. He has 30,000 acres in England, a castle that dates back to the Tudors, and a lineage that goes back to the Crusades. Clara looked at the portrait of the Duke included in the folder. He was a man with watery eyes and a chin that seemed to be retreating from his face in apology. He also, according to the papers, has a roof that is collapsing and a gambling debt that exceeds his annual income. Precisely, Silas grunted, a thin smile touching his lips. You will be a duchess, Clara. You will walk into rooms in London and Paris, and women who wouldn't look at me will be forced to curtsy to you. That is the dividend I expect from this investment. An investment, Clara whispered. Is that all I am now? A merger of two failing firms? Silas leaned forward, his eyes hardening into the flints that had broken the backs of labor unions. In this world, everything is a merger. Your mother and I have spent $500,000 this season alone to put you in this position. Do not mistake a parent's ambition for a daughter's hobby. You are the bridge, Clara. You are how the Huntington name becomes immortal.
The official market opened 3 nights later at a dinner party hosted by the Vanderbilts. The dining table was a 70-foot stretch of mahogany, draped in lace so fine it looked like spider webs. In the center, a miniature river had been constructed, complete with tiny floating swans and real lilies. It was a display of wealth so grotesque it felt almost violent, yet the guests ate their roasted pheasant as if it were nothing. Clara was seated between the Duke of Southshire and a young count from Prussia. The Duke, whose name was Lord Arthur Penhaligon, smelled faintly of mothballs and gin. "I am told," the Duke began, his voice a high-pitched aristocratic wheeze, "that your father's trains run all the way to the Pacific. It must be quite loud, all that steam and iron." "It is the sound of progress, Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice as polished as the silver in her hand. "Though I suppose progress is a noise one hears less frequently in the ruins of a Tudor estate." The table went silent for a heartbeat. Althea Huntington, sitting 3 seats down, went pale, but the Duke merely chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Spirited," the Duke remarked, turning to Silas. "I like a girl with a bit of steel in her. It makes the breaking of the spirit so much more rewarding." Clara felt a chill run down her spine that the heavy velvet drapes could not block out. She looked around the table. She saw other girls her age, Mary, Gladys, Consuelo, all sitting with their respective titles. They were the dollar princesses. They were being sold across the Atlantic to fix leaky roofs, pay off mistresses, and prop up a dying feudal system. And in return, their fathers would get a coat of arms to paint on their carriage doors. After dinner, the men retreated to the smoking room to discuss the dowry, the true heart of the negotiation. Clara sat in the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound books she was rarely expected to read. Across from her sat her...
"Why do you care?" Clara turned to him, her eyes bright with a sudden sharp anger. "You are part of this world. You eat their food, you drink their wine. Why do you play the prophet of doom?" Vance looked at her for a long time. For the first time, his cynical mask slipped. "Because I've seen what happens when the Gilded Age ends. It doesn't end with a whimper, it ends with a crash. And I would hate to see you crushed under the weight of a duke's debt when the ceiling finally gives way." The night concluded with a formal announcement in the drawing room. Silas Huntington stood with his arm around the Duke of Southshire. The room fell silent as the champagne was poured. "To a new alliance," Silas toasted, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had just bought a kingdom. "To the future Duchess of Southshire, my daughter, Clara." The room erupted in polite, measured applause. The 400 raised their glasses. Clara stood beside the Duke, her hand resting on his thin, bony arm. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "We shall leave for London in June," he whispered. "There is much to do. The estate needs a complete overhaul. I trust your father's checkbook is as deep as they say." Clara looked out at the sea of faces. She saw her mother's triumphant tears. She saw the envious glares of other mothers. And she saw Arthur Vance standing at the very back of the room, his glass unraised. She realized then that she was no longer a person. She was a trophy. She had been traded for a ghost of the past to secure a future she didn't want. The marriage market was closed, and Clara Huntington had been sold to the highest bidder. As the music began to play, Clara realized the corset wasn't the only thing suffocating her. The title was a heavier weight, and the Atlantic Ocean was about to become the moat of her new, very expensive, and very lonely prison. The architectural arms race and the staggering cost of building Newport cottages. The summer of 1894 was not a season, it was a siege. In the Gilded Age, the battlefields were not made of dirt and blood. They were made of marble, limestone, and gold leaf. As the heat of New York City became unbearable, the 400 retreated to the rocky shores of Newport, Rhode Island. But they did not go there for the sea air. They went there to build monuments to their own ego. They called these massive 70-room palatial estates cottages, a term so soaked in irony that it bordered on the obscene. Clara Huntington stood on the edge of the cliffs, the salt spray from the Atlantic dampening her silk parasol. Behind her, the Huntingtons' new summer residence, the Crystal Belvedere, was rising like a limestone ghost against the blue sky. $3 million, her father Silas muttered as he stood beside her. His eyes weren't on the ocean, but on the scaffolding. The grand staircase is being carved in Italy from a single block of Carrara marble. It will make the Vanderbilt's estate look like a servant's quarters. Clara watched the army of workmen. Hundreds of Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, and French artisans swarmed over the structure. They were building a dream that was too heavy to float. "Is it necessary, Father?" Clara asked, her voice nearly lost in the sound of hammers against stone. "We already have the mansion on Fifth Avenue. Why must we build a palace here that we only occupy for 8 weeks a year?" Silas turned to her, his face flushed with the heat of competition. "Because, Clara, in Newport, if you stop building, you start disappearing. The Astors are adding a ballroom of mirrors. The Belmonts have imported an entire French chateau. If we do not outbuild them, we are admitting that the Huntington line has reached its limit. This is not a house, it is an architectural arms race." Inside the half-finished halls of the Crystal Belvedere, the air was thick with the dust of opulence. Althea Huntington moved through the rooms with a set of blueprints clutched in her hand like a weapon. She was at war with the architects. "I want the ceiling of the music room to be gilded with 22-karat gold," she commanded, pointing toward the rafters. "And the floors, I want them inlaid with mahogany and mother-of-pearl. It must shimmer, Monsieur Richard. When the guests enter, I want them to feel as if they are stepping inside a diamond." The architect, a weary Frenchman, bowed low. "Madame, the weight of the gold and the marble, the foundation is already under immense pressure. We are building on the edge of a cliff." "Then reinforce it with steel," Althea snapped. "The foundation of a Huntington home is not made of rock, it is made of ambition." Clara walked through the skeleton of what would be her ballroom. The walls were to be made almost entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, hence the name, the Palace of Glass. It was designed to capture the sunlight and reflect the status of its owners. But as Clara touched the cold, jagged edge of a glass pane, she felt a strange sense of fragility. Glass was beautiful, yes, but it was also brittle. One tremor, one strike, and the whole illusion would shatter into 1,000 sharp pieces. The cost was not merely financial, it was spiritual. By July, the bills were arriving in stacks that threatened to overshadow the blueprints. Silas Huntington's brow was perpetually furrowed. The railroad strikes in the West were cutting into the quarterly profits, yet the demands of Newport did not cease. The cottage required a staff of 60 servants, a stable of 20 thoroughbreds, and a constant influx of imported delicacies. One evening, at a quiet dinner held in their temporary rental, a mere 20-room mansion, Arthur Vance appeared again. He had become a recurring specter in Clara's life, a reminder of the world outside the glass walls. "I saw the progress on your father's cottage today," Vance said, swirling his wine. "It is a masterpiece of excess. I believe he has successfully offended every person in Newport who values subtlety." "Subtlety is the luxury of those who have been rich for 200 years, Mr. Vance," Clara replied, though her heart wasn't in the defense. "We are still proving ourselves."
"At what price, Clara? Look at your father. He looks like a man who is holding the roof with his own shoulders. This palace of glass, it is a beautiful cage. But have you noticed the workmen? They are tired. The markets in New York are jittery. People are starting to whisper that the Gilded Age is built on credit, and credit is a very thin thread." Clara looked across the room at Silas, who was arguing with a contractor over the price of silk wallpaper. Vance was right. Her father looked older. The triumph of the debut was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of maintenance. "If the thread breaks, what happens to the glass?" Clara whispered. Vance leaned in, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "It falls, and those inside are the first to get cut." By the end of the summer, the Crystal Belvedere was near completion. It was a marvel of the modern world, a sprawling, glittering fortress of vanity. On the final night before they returned to the city, the Huntingtons stood on the grand terrace. The moon reflected off the glass walls, making the house appear as if it was glowing from within. It was, undeniably, the most beautiful house in Newport. But as the wind picked up from the Atlantic, whistling through the gaps in the stonework, Clara felt a shiver. She looked at the towering walls of glass and marble and realized that they had built a tomb for their fortune. The staggering cost her father spoke of wasn't just the millions of dollars, it was the peace of mind they had traded for a seat at the table of the elite. The architectural arms race had been won. The Huntingtons had the biggest cottage. They had the most gold. They had the most glass.
But as the first autumn leaf skittered across the marble terrace, Clara heard a faint sound, a hairline fracture perhaps, or just a house settling into its heavy foundation. It was a tiny clink of glass against stone, a quiet warning that the palaces of glass were never meant to weather the coming storm. The summer was over, the bills were due, and the Gilded Age was one season closer to the crash. The legendary masquerade balls where champagne flowed like water and diamonds were common as glass. The winter of 1895 arrived not with a chill, but with a roar of celebration. If the Newport cottages were the fortresses of the elite, the masquerade balls were their religious ceremonies. This was the pinnacle of the Gilded Age, a time when wealth was no longer something to be managed, it was something to be performed. The Huntington masquerade was designed to be the ball of the century, a night so expensive and so theatrical that it would silence the whispers of the looming financial instability in the West. "More orchids," Althea Huntington commanded. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the frantic activity of the ballroom. "I want them hanging from the chandeliers like weeping willows of lavender and white. If a guest looks up and sees anything but flowers, we have failed." The cost of the flowers alone was $60,000, a fortune that could have built dozens of schools. But in the Huntington household, such thoughts were considered treasonous. This was a symphony, and every note had to be perfect. Clara stood in her dressing room, staring at her reflection. She was no longer a girl, she was a spectacle. Her costume for the night was the Empress of the Stars. Her gown was crafted from midnight blue tulle, encrusted with 10,000 small diamonds and silver sequins that caught the light with every breath. On her head sat a tiara of celestial proportions, featuring a central yellow diamond the size of a pigeon's egg. "You look like a goddess, Clara," her mother whispered, adjusting the heavy silk mask that would hide Clara's face until midnight. "Tonight, the Duke of Southshire will see that he isn't just marrying a fortune, he is marrying a legend." "It's so heavy, Mother," Clara replied, her neck straining under the weight of the jewels. "I feel as though I'm wearing a suit of armor made of light." "That is exactly what it is," Althea said, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying intensity. "In this room, your jewels are your protection. The more you wear, the less they can hurt you."
As the first carriages arrived at 10 o'clock, Fifth Avenue was choked with spectators. The police had to be called to push back the crowds of the poor, the unwashed, who stood in the freezing slush just to catch a glimpse of a silk hem or a feathered fan. Inside, however, the temperature was a perfect artificial spring. The ballroom was a fever dream of excess. There were guests dressed as Louis XIV, as Roman emperors, and as mythical creatures. One woman arrived as an electric light, wearing a dress wired with hundreds of tiny glowing bulbs powered by a battery pack hidden in her bustle. Champagne did not just flow, it was the atmosphere. In the corner of the room, a fountain had been constructed that cascaded with vintage Moet Chandon instead of water. Servants in 18th century livery moved through the crowd with silver trays piled high with plover's eggs, caviar, and truffles dusted with edible gold. Clara moved through the crowd, a shimmering ghost of blue and silver. She watched the guests. There was a desperate energy in the room, a frenetic need to dance faster, to drink more, and to laugh louder. "The music is a bit too fast, don't you think?" Clara turned. Even behind a black silk mask, she recognized Arthur Vance's voice. He was dressed simply as a Venetian plague doctor, a choice that felt dangerously cynical for a night of such beauty. "It is a waltz, Mr. Vance," Clara's voice muffled by her own mask. "It is supposed to be fast." "It sounds like a heartbeat before a stroke," Vance replied, stepping closer. "Look at them, Clara. They are wearing the GDP of small nations on their backs. Do you know what's happening in the streets tonight? There are bread lines 3 blocks long, just 20 minutes from this front door." "Tonight is not about the streets," Clara snapped, though a pang of guilt pierced her chest. "Tonight is about art, about beauty." "No," Vance whispered, his eyes dark behind the beak of his mask. "Tonight is about a distraction. Your father's railroad stocks dropped another 4 points today. He is throwing this ball to prove he is still a king, but even kings can run out of silver." Clara looked towards her father. Silas Huntington was dressed as King Midas, a choice so literal it was almost tragic. He was holding a glass of champagne, laughing with the Duke of Southshire, but his hand was shaking, just a fraction, causing the golden liquid to tremble. At midnight, the unmasking began. The orchestra reached a crashing crescendo. On the signal, hundreds of hands reached up to remove their silk and velvet disguises. The room was a sea of flushed faces, sweat-streaked makeup, and exhausted eyes. The Duke of Southshire approached Clara, his face pale and oily. "A triumph, my dear, truly. My family's estate in England hasn't seen a night like this since the Regency. I can't wait to see what you do with the Southshire ballroom once your father's dowry clears the bank." The mention of the money, so blunt and so cold, made the room feel suddenly chilly. Clara looked towards her father. The fountain of champagne was beginning to look less like a marvel and more like a waste. Suddenly, a commotion broke out at the entrance of the ballroom. One of the servants, his face pale with fear, whispered something into Silas Huntington's ear. Silas's face went from the gold of Midas to the gray of ash. He dropped his glass. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and final, like a gunshot in a cathedral. The music faltered. The guests turned, their diamonds glittering under the electric lights. "What is it, Silas?" Althea asked, stepping forward, her empress mask still clutched in her hand. Silas didn't answer. He looked at Clara, not with the pride of a father, but with the look of a man who had just seen a ghost. He turned and walked out of the ballroom without a word, leaving the symphony of excess to ring out in a hollow, terrifying silence. Clara stood in the center of the room, her 10,000 diamonds mocking her. The diamonds were indeed common as glass, and in that moment she realized they were just as easily broken. The party was not over, but the dream was. The music resumed, But to Clara's ears, it no longer sounded like a waltz, it sounded like the beginning of a requiem. First whispers of bad investments and the precarious nature of railroad stocks. The morning after the masquerade did not smell of roses, it smelled of stale tobacco and the cold metallic scent of fear. The great Huntington mansion was in a state of festive decay. Half-empty champagne flutes sat on marble mantels, the bubbles long since dead. Wilting orchids draped over the banisters like the limp bodies of fallen soldiers. But the most chilling change was the silence. The music had stopped, and in its place was a heavy, suffocating tension that no amount of gold leaf could hide. Clara found her father in his private study at 7 in the morning. He was still wearing his King Midas costume, though he had stripped off the golden crown. He looked less like a king and more like a man waiting for his executioner. "Father?" Clara whispered, standing in the doorway.
Silas Huntington didn't look up. His desk was buried under a blizzard of telegrams, thin strips of yellow paper that carried the news of his ruin. "The Reading Railroad has collapsed into receivership, Clara. The Northern Pacific is following. It's a contagion, a financial rot that is eating through the very tracks I laid across this country." "But we are the Huntingtons," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Our wealth is solid. It's in the steel. It's in the land." "Our wealth," Silas said, finally looking at her with hollowed-out eyes, "is built on the promise of future profits. And today, the world decided it no longer believes in promises. The banks are calling in the loans for the Crystal Belvedere. The millions I spent on your debut, the diamonds on your neck, it was all borrowed against the hope that the rails would never stop turning." The whispers began at the ladies' luncheons and the men's clubs by noon. In the Gilded Age, news traveled via the social telegraph, a network of gossip more efficient than any wire. At the Waldorf Astoria, the usual clatter of silver against porcelain was replaced by hushed, urgent tones. "I heard Silas Huntington mortgaged his Fifth Avenue house to pay for that ball," a woman whispered behind a lace fan. "I heard the Duke of Southshire is already looking for a way to annul the engagement," her companion replied, sipping her tea with a predatory elegance. "After all, a duke doesn't marry a pauper, even if she does have a pretty face." Althea Huntington refused to acknowledge the rumors. She spent the afternoon ordering new custom-made hats from Paris, as if the sheer act of spending could ward off the bankruptcy. She moved through the house like a ghost of her own former self, her jaw set so tight it looked as though it might snap. "Mother, we must talk about the accounts," Clara pleaded in the hallway. "There is nothing to talk about, Clara," Althea snapped, her voice brittle. "We are simply experiencing a temporary market fluctuation. To speak of it is to make it real. Go and write a thank you note to the Duchess. We must maintain the facade until the storm passes. If society smells blood, they will tear us apart." But the blood was already in the water. The cracks in the facade weren't just financial, they were structural. In the basement of the mansion, the coal delivery was turned away because the Huntington credit was no longer accepted. In the kitchen, the chef, a man who had cooked for royalty, demanded his back wages in cash, refusing to accept a Huntington check. Slipped out of the house, desperate for air. She walked toward the park, avoiding the eyes of the other socialites in their carriages. She felt as though she were made of glass, visible, fragile, and on the verge of shattering. The view is different when the pedestal starts to shake, isn't it? She didn't need to look. Arthur Vance was walking beside her, his coat collar turned up against the biting wind. He didn't look triumphant. He looked weary. "You knew," Clara said, stopping in her tracks. "You told me the music would stop." "I didn't need a crystal ball, Clara. I just needed to read the ledgers. Your father was over-leveraged. He built a kingdom of air and decorated it with railroad ties. The panic of 1893 was just the beginning.
Now the bill for all this excess is finally coming due. "What am I supposed to do?" Clara asked, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know how to be anything other than what they made me." Vance looked at her, and for the first time there was genuine pity in his eyes. "The first thing you do is take off the pearls, Clara. They are too heavy for a woman who needs to run. The second thing you do is realize that you are not your father's debt. You are the only thing in that house that isn't a bad investment." As night fell, the Huntington mansion looked as grand as ever from the outside. The electric lights blazed in every window, a final desperate lie told to the city. But inside, Silas Huntington sat in the dark. He had turned off the lights in his study. He sat with a single candle, watching the yellow telegrams pile up like autumn leaves. The railroad stocks, once the gold standard of American industry, were now worth less than the paper they were printed on. The 400 were already crossing the Huntington name off their dinner lists. The Duke was silent. The banks were loud. Clara stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down into the dark foyer. She heard a faint sound, a rhythmic, scratching noise. It was the sound of her father's pen, signing away the rights to their horses, their art, and their name. The crack in the facade had become a canyon, and as the wind howled down Fifth Avenue, Clara realized that the golden debut was over. The era of the ballroom was ending, and the era of the courtroom was about to begin. The Gilded Age was tarnishing, and beneath the gold there was only cold, hard iron. Behind closed doors, the struggle to hide growing debts from the prying eyes of society. The curtains of the Huntington mansion were drawn tight, yet the house had never felt more exposed. In the Gilded Age, a woman's reputation was like a fine silk gown. Once it was stained, it could never be truly cleaned. Althea Huntington understood this better than she understood her own daughter. To Althea, the mounting debts were not a financial problem, they were a social contagion. If the world knew they were bleeding money, the 400 would treat them like lepers. "We shall hold the opera box for the season," Althea declared, her voice echoing in the hollow breakfast room. She was meticulously sewing a piece of loose lace back onto her sleeve. She did it herself, because they had already dismissed the third-floor maids to cut costs. "Mother, the opera box costs $800 a night," Clara whispered, looking at the meager plate of toast before her. The silver service was still polished, but the butter was no longer imported from France. "We are writing checks that the bank is flagging in red ink. We are living in a house of cards." "Then we must make sure there is no wind, Clara," Althea snapped, her needle slipping and piercing her thumb. A tiny, perfect bead of crimson blood bloomed on the white silk. She didn't flinch. "We go to the opera, we wear the family emeralds, we smile at Mrs. Astor until our faces ache. If we stop, the creditors will realize we are afraid, and once they see fear, they will take the roof from over our heads." The weeks that followed were a masterclass in deception. It was the era of silk and secrets. Outside, Clara appeared the picture of serenity. She rode in the carriage through Central Park, her posture perfect, her expression of bored, aristocratic indifference. But beneath her heavy velvet skirts, her knees were shaking. Every time a footman approached with a silver tray, she prayed it was an invitation and not another final notice from the grocer or the milliner. Inside the mansion, the symphony of excess had turned into a silent dirge. To save on coal, only the rooms they occupied were heated. Clara spent her evenings in the library, wrapped in old wool shawls, huddled near a dying fire, while her father sat at his desk, his eyes red-rimmed from staring at bankruptcy ledgers. "I sold the Western Union shares today," Silas whispered one evening, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "For 10 cents on the dollar. It's not enough to cover the interest on the Newport mortgage. We are hemorrhaging. The silk is hiding a corpse." "Then let it die, father," Clara said, kneeling beside him. "Sell the house, sell the paintings. Let us go somewhere quiet, where we don't have to lie anymore." Silas looked at her, and for a moment the titan of industry looked like a frightened child. "I don't know how to be poor, Clara. I forgot how to breathe air that doesn't smell of money."
The tension reached a breaking point during the opera night at the Academy of Music. The Huntingtons arrived in their finest carriage, the horses' coats groomed to a high shine with the last of the expensive oils. Clara wore a gown of emerald silk, her neck draped in the Huntington heirloom diamonds. To the audience in the parterre, they looked as wealthy as the day they arrived. But as they took their seats in box 12, the silence from the neighboring boxes was deafening. Mrs. Van Allen, seated in the box to their left, did not nod. She did not raise her opera glasses. She simply turned her shoulder, a cut so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "They know," Clara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They suspect," Althea corrected, her fan fluttering with a rhythmic, hypnotic speed. "That is why you must go to the foyer during the intermission. You must speak to the Duke. You must show them that the engagement is solid. A duke's hand is the best shield against a banker's heart." In the foyer, the air was thick with perfume and malice. Clara spotted the Duke of Southshire near the champagne fountain. He was surrounded by a group of young men, laughing at a joke. When he saw Clara, his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the look a man gives a sinking ship. "Miss Huntington," he said, bowing perfunctorily, "I've just been telling the chaps I've had some distressing news from my solicitors in London. It seems my presence is required at Southshire immediately, a matter of inheritance taxes." "When do you leave?" Clara asked, her voice steady only by sheer force of will. "Tomorrow," the Duke replied. He didn't look at her. He looked at the emeralds on her neck, as if calculating if they were real or paste. "I'm afraid our arrangements must be put on hold until the air clears in New York." He walked away before she could respond. The silk had failed. The secret was out. Clara returned to the box, her face like marble. She didn't tell her mother. She didn't have to. The way the Duke had avoided her was a signal that the entire room had witnessed. On the drive home, the carriage felt like a tumbril taking them to the guillotine. When they reached the Fifth Avenue mansion, a man was standing by the iron gates. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a heavy gray coat and holding a legal satchel. He didn't wait for them to disembark. He stepped forward and handed a paper to the footman. "A writ of attachment," Silas whispered, as he read the document under the carriage lamp. "They've placed a lien on the furniture, the paintings, even the silver." Althea walked past the man as if he were invisible, her silk skirts hissing against the stone steps. She entered the house and climbed the stairs to her room without a word. Clara stood in the foyer, looking at the grand staircase she had descended so triumphantly only a year ago. The electric lights flickered, a brownout, and then died. The house was plunged into darkness. "It's over, isn't it?" Clara asked the shadows. From the darkness of the library, she heard the sound of a single sob, not from her mother, but from her father. The man who had built empires was crying in the dark. The silk was torn, the secrets were bared, and as Clara stood in the cold, silent hall, she realized that the hardest part of being a Gilded Age heiress wasn't losing the money, it was the suffocating weight of the mask they had worn to hide the truth. The bankruptcy was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. A sudden financial crash that turns paper fortunes into worthless dust. The morning of May 5, 1893, began with a deceptive stillness. By noon, that stillness had been replaced by a roar that could be heard from the steps of the Sub-Treasury building all the way to the gilded parlors of Fifth Avenue. It was the sound of a world breaking. In the Gilded Age, wealth was a ghost. It lived in the ink of stock certificates and the promises of railroad bonds.
When the panic struck, that ghost vanished, leaving behind nothing but piles of worthless paper and a city paralyzed by terror. Silas Huntington was not at home. He was in the heart of the storm, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The scene was one of primal chaos. Men in silk hats, titans who ruled the American economy with a flick of a pen, were now screaming, weeping, and clawing at each other's lapels. The air was thick with sweat and the dust of 1,000 discarded ticker tapes. "Sell! Sell at any price!" a voice shrieked over the din. Silas stood in the center of the floor, a monolith of granite in a sea of madness. He watched the ticker tape. It was a serpent of paper, spitting out numbers that defied logic. Northern Pacific had dropped 30 points in an hour. Union Pacific was in free fall. His own Huntington Rail holdings, the bedrock of his family's existence, were being slaughtered. "Mr. Huntington," his head clerk gasped, pushing through the crowd with his collar torn. "The banks have stopped lending. They're closing the gold window. We're being liquidated." "Sir," the clerk whispered, his eyes wide with horror, "there is no price. There are only sellers. The market is gone." Back at the mansion, Clara stood by the window, watching the newsboys run down the street. Their cries drifted up through the glass, shouts of panic and crash and suicide on Wall Street. She turned to see her mother, Althea, standing in the center of the drawing room. Althea was dressed in a morning gown of pale lavender silk, but her face was the color of curdled milk. She was holding a letter from their primary bank. "They have frozen the accounts, Clara," Althea said, her voice flat, devoid of the sharp command it usually carried. "Where is father?" Clara asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "He is with the other wolves," Althea replied, sinking into a velvet chair. She looked at the room, the European paintings, the French clocks, the Italian marble. Yesterday, these things were worth millions. Today, they were just heavy objects that they no longer truly owned. The panic was not just a financial term, it was a physical weight. It was the realization that the gilded part of the age was merely a thin veneer of gold leaf over a base of lead. The gold was being scraped away by the minute. As the sun began to set, the ticker tape in Silas's private office, connected by a direct wire to the exchange, suddenly went dead. The clicking stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise of the morning. The door to the mansion groaned open. Silas Huntington walked in. He didn't look like a titan. He looked like a ghost. His coat was missing a button, his hair was disheveled, and his hands were stained with black ink from hundreds of sell orders he had signed in a desperate attempt to save his name. He walked past the servants, who stood in the hallway like mourners at a funeral. He walked into the library and sat down at his mahogany desk. Clara followed him. "Father?" He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He reached into his desk and pulled out a stack of Huntington Rail bonds. Only 24 hours ago, these papers represented the power to move mountains and build cities. Now Silas crumpled one in his hand. "Dust, Clara." The sound of the paper crinkling was loud in the still room.
What happens now? Silas leaned back, the shadows of the library swallowing his face. Now the vultures arrive. The creditors will be here by morning. The 400 will pretend they never knew our names. And you, my dear Clara, the Duke is gone. The dowry is gone. You are no longer the most sought-after heiress in New York. "I am just Clara," she said, a strange, cold sense of relief washing over her. "Yes," Silas sighed, closing his eyes. "Just Clara, with nothing but the clothes on your back and a name that people will now use as a warning." That night, the lights of Fifth Avenue seemed to dim. Across the city, men who had been millionaires at breakfast were penniless by dinner. The paper fortunes had burned in the heat of the panic. The Huntington family sat in their dark palace, listening to the ticking of the clocks they could no longer afford to keep. The market had crashed, and as it fell, it took the illusions of the Gilded Age with it. The ballroom was empty, the bankruptcy was certain, and the dust of their fallen empire was beginning to settle over everything they loved. Discovering that the family patriarch's estate is more debt than gold. The illusion of wealth is a powerful sedative, but the awakening is a violent cold shower. For Clara Huntington, the morning after the panic was the day the air finally ran out. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, once a symbol of solid, immovable power, now felt like a hollow shell. The servants moved like shadows, their footsteps silent on the Persian rugs, not out of respect, but out of the realization that there was no longer any money to pay for the sound of their labor. In the center of the library, the family's lawyer, Mr. Arbuthnot, sat behind a mountain of leather-bound ledgers and frantic telegrams. He was a man who had spent 40 years counting other people's money, and today his face was as gray as a tombstone. "I have spent the night auditing the personal accounts, Silas," Arbuthnot said, his voice cracking like dry wood. "I'm afraid the situation is existential." Althea Huntington, still dressed in a silk morning gown that now seemed like a mockery, clutched her handkerchief. "The trust funds, Arbuthnot. Surely the girls' dowries and the trust established in '88 are shielded." Arbuthnot looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. There was no pity in his eyes, only the cold clarity of a mathematician. "There are no trust funds, Mrs. Huntington. Mr. Huntington dissolved them 3 years ago to fund the expansion of the Western Rail Spur. He replaced the cash with letter of intent bonds." "Letter of intent?" Clara asked, her voice steady, but her heart sinking. "What does that mean?" "It means," Arbuthnot replied, "that your inheritance is made of air. It is a promise to pay you with money that was never actually earned. It was a gamble on a future that the market just canceled." The investigation into the Huntington estate was a journey through a labyrinth of deception. As the day progressed, the gold vanished in layers. The Newport cottage, mortgaged to the eaves to pay for the Symphony of Excess ball. The Huntington art collection, the Rembrandts and Monets that Althea had bragged about. They were purchased on margin, meaning the dealers still owned 70% of the canvas. Even the very silver spoons on the breakfast table were listed as collateral for a short-term loan that had expired the previous Friday. Silas Huntington sat in the corner of the room, staring at his hands. He looked at the skin and bone as if wondering if they too were owned by the Bank of New York. "You lied to us, Father," Clara said, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "It wasn't a lie," Silas suddenly roared, standing up so abruptly his chair toppled over. The sound echoed in the cavernous room like a gunshot. "It was momentum. In the railroad business, you don't wait for the gold to arrive. You build the track so the gold has to come. I was weeks away from the merger. If the market had held for just 1 more month, we would have been the wealthiest family in the history of this country. But the market didn't hold, and now we are sitting in a palace that belongs to the bank, wearing clothes that belong to the tailor, and inheriting a name that belongs to the newspapers." Men in dark suits, the executors of the creditors, began to move through the house with clipboards. They didn't speak to the family, they simply tagged the furniture. A small yellow sticker was placed on the grand piano, another on the marble bust of Caesar in the hallway. Each sticker was a nail in the coffin of their social identity. Clara watched as a man appraised her mother's vanity table. He picked up a crystal perfume bottle, noted its weight, and scribbled a number.
In that moment, Clara realized that to the world they were no longer people, they were a collection of assets to be liquidated. Everything we thought was an inheritance is just a debt in disguise. She walked to the window and saw a crowd gathering on the sidewalk. These weren't the unwashed poor from the debut night. These were the middle-class investors, men who had put their life savings into Huntington rail bonds because they trusted the Huntington name. They weren't there to admire the house. They were there to see if the man who broke them was still breathing. As the sun set, Arbuthnot closed the final ledger with a definitive thud. The bottom line, Silas, is this. Once the creditors are satisfied, there will be nothing left. Not the house, not the horses, not even the family jewels if the court deems them part of the estate. You are not just bankrupt, you are in the negative to the sum of $4 million. Althea fainted then, a silent, graceful collapse on the Persian rug. Clara didn't move to help her. She simply watched her mother lie there among the inheritance of air. Clara realized that her father had spent his life building a palace of glass, but he had forgotten that air cannot support the weight of a palace. They had lived as gods, but they were merely actors on a stage where the rent was overdue. "I have nothing to give you, Clara," Silas said, his voice now a hollow rasp. "I wanted to give you the world, and I've left you with a bill for it." "No, Father," Clara said, looking at the yellow stickers that now decorated their home. "You gave me the truth. It's the most expensive thing in this house, and for once, it's actually ours." The inheritance of air was complete. The Huntingtons were no longer owners of an empire. They were the occupants of a memory. And as the night air chilled the unheated room, Clara knew that the next day wouldn't begin with a bell for breakfast. It would begin with a knock at the door from the sheriff. Selling the jewelry in secret to pay the servants' wages. Pride is a luxury that outlasts gold, and for the Huntingtons, it was the only thing left to burn. By the late spring of 1893, the grand house on Fifth Avenue had become a theater of the absurd. To the passers-by on the street, the mansion still looked like the seat of a dynasty. The brass railings were still polished, the heavy velvet curtains remained drawn with regal precision, and once a week, Althea Huntington would still sit in the carriage and be driven around the park for an hour. But inside, the mansion was a hollowed-out carcass. The most terrifying threat was not the banks, it was the servants. In the Gilded Age, the silence of a butler or a lady's maid was a commodity that had to be purchased. If the cook left in a fit of rage over unpaid wages, the news would reach the 400 within the hour. The facade would crumble, and the Huntingtons would be cast out before they could find a place to hide. "We owe the staff 3 months of back pay," Silas whispered in the dim light of the library. He hadn't turned on the electric lights for days, claiming the glare hurt his eyes, though Clara knew it was because the utility bill was 5 months overdue. The head butler, Stevens, approached me today. He was polite. He is always polite, but there was a threat in his eyes. He has a family in the tenements. He cannot eat my excuses anymore. Clara looked at her mother. Althea was sitting at her vanity, staring at her own reflection as if she didn't recognize the woman in the glass. The emeralds, the uncut emeralds from the Romanoff auction. They are the only things the creditors haven't tagged yet because I kept them in the small safe behind the portrait. "Mother, those are your legacy," Clara said. "Legacy is for people who have a future," Clara replied. She stood up, her movements stiff and mechanical. "Tonight, they are merely bread and coal. We must sell them, but it must be done in the shadows. If a jeweler on Fifth Avenue
Don't lie to me, girl. I cut the side stones for this set 10 years ago for Silas Huntington. He paid $50,000 for the necklace. The jeweler looked at her through the loop, his eye magnified and monstrous. I can give you $5,000, cash, tonight. $5,000? Clara gasped. That is a tenth of their value. The value of a gem is what a man can pay when he's in a hurry, the jeweler said, shrugging. And you, Miss Huntington, look like you are in a very great hurry. Take it, or take the stones back to the street and see if the police ask why a lady is walking Maiden Lane at 1 in the morning. Clara looked at the money, a thick stack of worn bills. It was enough to pay the servants. It was enough to keep the butler silent for another month. It was the price of their appearance. "I'll take it," she whispered. She returned to the mansion as the milk wagons were beginning their rounds. The house was freezing. She found her father waiting in the foyer, pacing like a caged animal. When she handed him the cash, he didn't thank her. He snatched it and began counting it with a feverish intensity. "Stevens!" Silas called out, his voice cracking. The butler appeared from the shadows of the dining room. He looked at the cash in Silas's hand. "Your wages, Stevens, and a bonus for your discretion," Silas said, thrusting a handful of bills at the man. "See that the staff is fed, and tell the cook we are expecting guests for tea on Thursday. A small affair, but it must look perfect." Stevens took the money. He looked at the bills, then at the disheveled, broken man standing before him. He didn't bow as low as he used to. The power dynamic had shifted. The servant now knew the master was a thief of his own treasures. For the next week, the appearance was maintained. The tea was served on Thursday. A few remaining friends, those too out of the loop to know the full extent of the ruin, came and drank Darjeeling from the silver pots. Althea laughed at all the right moments. Clara played the piano, her fingers tracing the keys with a hollow elegance. But as Clara looked around the room, she saw the cost. Her portrait of her grandmother had been moved to cover the spot where a small safe had been emptied. Her mother's wrists, usually heavy with gold, were now covered by long lace sleeves to hide their nakedness. They were eating expensive sandwiches paid for by the loss of their history. Every bite was the taste of an emerald. Every sip of tea was a fragment of a lost legacy. The servants moved with a new, terrifying confidence. They knew. They were being paid in secret blood money, and the deference they showed was now a mockery. "How long can we do this, Mother?" asked Clara after the guests had left. Althea was staring at the empty tea service. "Until the jewelry box is empty, Clara, or until the bank doors are broken down, whichever comes first." The cost of keeping appearances was higher than any debt. It was the slow, agonizing erosion of their dignity, one gem at a time. They were still the Huntingtons to the world, but inside the palace of glass, they were becoming ghosts, haunting a life they could no longer afford to live. The emeralds were gone, the servants were paid, and the curtain was stayed for one more week. But the jewelry box was growing light, and the darkness was growing very, very heavy. The cold shoulder of the elite as the scent of poverty begins to linger. In the Gilded Age, there was a fate far worse than death, and that fate was being dropped. It did not happen with a scream or a grand gesture. It happened with a silence so profound it felt like a winter frost. For Clara Huntington, the realization came not from a legal document, but from the sudden, terrifying emptiness of the mailbox. The thick, cream-colored invitations that once arrived by the dozen, invitations to yacht races, garden parties, and midnight suppers, simply ceased to exist. "The Astor Garden Party is this afternoon," Althea Huntington said, her voice trembling as she adjusted her hat in the foyer. She was wearing a dress that had been altered 3 times to hide its age. "We have not received our cards, but surely it is a clerical error. The Huntingtons do not get missed." "Mother, please," Clara whispered, her heart aching with a mixture of pity and shame. "Do not go there. The wind has changed. Can't you feel the chill?" "We are going, Clara," Althea commanded, her eyes burning with a desperate, manic light. "If we are not seen, we are forgotten, and to be forgotten in New York is to cease to breathe." The Astor estate was a sea of pastel silks and white parasols. As the Huntington carriage, now pulled by a single aging horse they hadn't yet sold, clattered up the drive, a hush fell over the lawn. It was the social cold front. As Clara stepped onto the grass, she felt the temperature drop. It wasn't the weather, it was the collective turning of backs. Women who had sipped her father's champagne only months now suddenly found the embroidery on their fans fascinating. Men who had begged for her hand in the ballroom now looked through her as if she were made of thin, transparent glass. "Mrs. Van Allen," Clara called out, her voice a bit too loud, a bit too eager. "What a charming arrangement of roses!" Mrs. Van Allen, a woman whose pedigree was as old as the Hudson River, paused. She did not turn around, she merely adjusted her lace shawl and spoke to the woman beside her. "Do you smell that, Gertrude? There is a certain mustiness in the air today, like a house that hasn't been aired out in years." The mustiness was the scent of poverty. It didn't matter that Clara was wearing silk. The elite could smell the desperation, the unpaid taxes, and the secret sales of emeralds. They could smell the failure. Clara wandered towards the refreshment tent, her head held high, though her vision was blurred with unshed tears. She saw Mary Livingston, a girl she had known since childhood, standing near the lemonades. Clara moved towards her, desperate for a single friendly word. "Mary," Clara said softly. Mary turned. For a second, her eyes showed a flash of the old warmth, but then she looked at her mother, who was watching from across the lawn with a sharp, warning glare. Mary's face hardened. "I'm sorry, Miss Huntington. I believe I've misplaced my dance card. Excuse me." Miss Huntington, not Clara. The formal address was a wall of iron. Clara stood alone in the center of the elite circle. She realized then that society was not a group of friends, it was a herd, and she was the wounded animal that—
"Don't lie to me, girl. I cut the side stones for this set 10 years ago for Silas Huntington. He paid $50,000 for the necklace." The jeweler looked at her through the loop, his eye magnified and monstrous. "I can give you $5,000, cash, tonight." "$5,000?" Clara gasped. "That is 1/10 of their value." "The value of a gem is what a man can pay when he's in a hurry," the jeweler said, shrugging. "And you, Miss Huntington, look like you are in a very great hurry. Take it, or take the stones back to the street and see if the police ask why a lady is walking Maiden Lane at 1 in the morning." Clara looked at the money, a thick stack of worn bills. It was enough to pay the servants. It was enough to keep the butler silent for another month. It was the price of their appearance. "I'll take it," she whispered. She returned to the mansion as the milk wagons were beginning their rounds. The house was freezing. She found her father waiting in the foyer, pacing like a caged animal. When she handed him the cash, he didn't thank her. He snatched it and began counting it with a feverish intensity. "Stevens!" Silas called out, his voice cracking. The butler appeared from the shadows of the dining room. He looked at the cash in Silas's hand. "Your wages, Stevens, and a bonus for your discretion," Silas said, thrusting a handful of bills at the man. "See that the staff is fed, and tell the cook we are expecting guests for tea on Thursday. A small affair, but it must look perfect." Stevens took the money. He looked at the bills, then at the disheveled, broken man standing before him. He didn't bow as low as he used to. The power dynamic had shifted. The servant now knew the master was a thief of his own treasures. For the next week, the appearance was maintained. The tea was served on Thursday. A few remaining friends, those too out of the loop to know the full extent of the ruin, came and drank Darjeeling from the silver pots. Althea laughed at all the right moments. Clara played the piano, her fingers tracing the keys with a hollow elegance. But as Clara looked around the room, she saw the cost. Her portrait of her grandmother had been moved to cover the spot where a small safe had been emptied. Her mother's wrists, usually heavy with gold, were now covered by long lace sleeves to hide their nakedness. They were eating expensive sandwiches paid for by the loss of their history. Every bite was the taste of an emerald. Every sip of tea was a fragment of a lost legacy. The servants moved with a new, terrifying confidence. They knew. They were being paid in secret blood money, and the deference they showed was now a mockery. "How long can we do this, Mother?" asked Clara after the guests had left. Althea was staring at the empty tea service. "Until the jewelry box is empty, Clara, or until the bank doors are broken down, whichever comes first. The cost of keeping appearances."
"I'm here because I don't mind the scent of mustiness, Clara," he said, stepping toward her. "And because I wanted to see if you would finally stop trying to climb a ladder that has been pulled up." "They hate us," Clara whispered. "No," Vance corrected. "They don't hate you. Hate requires energy. They are simply erasing you. To them, wealth is the only thing that makes a person real. Without it, you are a ghost haunting their garden, and they don't like ghosts." The ride home was the longest hour of Clara's life. Althea sat in the carriage, her back straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, but as they passed the gates of their mansion, she looked at the for sale sign that had been hammered into the lawn by the bank that morning. "They didn't look at me, Clara," Althea said, her voice finally breaking. "I was standing right in front of Caroline Astor, and she looked right through me, as if I were a servant, as if I were nothing." "We are nothing to them, Mother," Clara said, reaching for her mother's hand. "We were only the gold we brought to the table. Now that the gold is gone, the chair has been taken away." Inside the house, the axile was mirrored in the architecture. The grand staircase felt too wide. The ballroom was a cavern of dust. The isolation was complete. The world of the 400 had closed its gates, and the Huntingtons were on the outside, standing in the cold, with nothing but their memories and their debts to keep them warm. Clara went to her room and looked at her debut gown hanging in the wardrobe. It looked like the skin of a creature that had died long ago. She realized that the Gilded Age was over for her. The exile was not just a loss of invitations, it was the loss of a self she had never really known. The scent of poverty was in the curtains, it was in the air, and most of all, it was in the silence of the telephone that no longer rang. The Huntington name was now a ghost story told to keep other heiresses from spending too much. The exile was final, the gates were shut, and the night was just beginning. As the last of the bidders left, carrying pieces of the Huntington life under their arms like scavenged wood, the house fell into a terrifying silence. The gilded auction was over. The heirlooms were scattered across the city. The French furniture was sitting in the parlors of strangers. Clara looked at the empty rooms. The palace of glass was now just a shell of stone and dust. She felt a strange, cold freedom. The gilded cage had been dismantled, and though she was standing in the ruins, for the first time in her life, she was no longer an asset. She was a woman, standing in a house that was no longer a home, waiting for the first night of her new, impoverished life to begin. The hammer had fallen, the debt was settled,
The Huntington era had officially ended. The physical and emotional transition from couture gowns to ready-to-wear reality. For 21 years, Clara Huntington's day had started with the rhythmic pull of silk curtains and the hushed voice of a maid offering a tray of chocolate. But on this morning, the first morning after the Gilded auction, the silence was broken only by the cold, biting whistle of the wind through an empty house. There were no maids, there was no chocolate, there was only the harsh, unforgiving light of a new reality. Clara stood in her bedroom, which was now a cavern of echoes. Her massive canopy bed had been hauled away. She had spent the night on a thin pallet on the floor. But the most profound change lay across the single wooden chair remaining in the room, her new wardrobe. Gone were the Worth gowns of Lyon silk and Brussels lace. In their place sat a dress of dark, scratchy wool and a simple cotton blouse. It was ready to wear, a term that in 1893 was synonymous with the common, the anonymous, and the poor. From silk to cotton, Clara whispered, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the fabric. The cotton didn't slide through her fingers, it resisted. It felt honest, and it felt like a punishment. The act of dressing was a new kind of labor. Without a lady's maid to pull the laces, Clara struggled with her own corset, a simpler, cheaper version made of stiff canvas instead of fine brocade. She had to loop the laces around the bedpost just to gain enough leverage to tighten them. Her breath hitched, her knuckles turned white. For the first time, she felt the physical weight of her own survival. As she buttoned the cotton blouse, the buttons made of cheap bone rather than mother of pearl, she looked in the small, cracked hand mirror she had hidden from the auctioneer. The woman looking back was different. The gilded heiress had been a creature of light and shimmer. This new woman was a creature of shadow and substance. "You look capable," a voice came from the doorway. It was Althea. Her mother looked as though she had aged a decade in a single night. She was wearing a faded silk morning coat, the last remnant of her former life, but beneath it she wore the same coarse cotton petticoats as Clara. "I feel like a stranger in my own skin, Mother," Clara said, smoothing the apron over her hips. "That is because you are wearing the skin of the people we used to ignore," Althea replied, her voice brittle. "Cotton is for the kitchen, silk is for the parlor, and we, Clara, no longer have a parlor." The transition was not just physical, it was a sensory assault. Clara had to learn the language of the ready-to-wear world. She learned that wool captures the smell of coal smoke and holds it. She learned that cotton stays damp against the skin long after the rain has stopped. She learned the shame of a frayed cuff and the indignity of a hem that had been turned twice to hide the wear. One afternoon, Clara ventured out to a local mercantile store to buy soap, a task she had never performed in her life. As she stood in line, her cotton skirts brushing against those of laundresses and shopgirls, she felt a strange, dizzying sense of invisibility. In her silk days, the world had parted for her like the Red Sea. Now she was just another body in the crowd. A man bumped into her shoulder and didn't apologize. A clerk spoke to her with a sharp, impatient tone. "Hurry up, miss. I haven't got all day for dreamers." Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to scream that she was a Huntington, that her father had built the railroads that brought the very soap to this store. But she looked down at her rough cotton sleeves and realized the truth. The clothes were the person. In cotton, she was nothing. She was a ghost of a class that had no use for her anymore. The emotional breaking point came that evening. She found a scrap of silk, a discarded ribbon from her debut gown, stuck in the floorboards of the empty nursery. She held it to her cheek.
It was so soft, so cool, so impossibly light. It represented a world where friction didn't exist, where every surface was polished and every burden was carried by someone else. She began to sob, not for the money, but for the softness. "Don't," a voice said. She looked up to see Arthur Vance. He had let himself in through the unlocked front door. He was carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "The silk is a lie, Clara. It's a beautiful lie, but it makes you weak. It makes you think the world owes you a gentle touch. It doesn't." "It hurts, Arthur," she whispered. "The cotton, it chafes. Everything is so loud and so rough." "That is the feeling of being alive," Arthur said firmly. He opened the parcel. Inside were a pair of sturdy leather boots, not the thin kidskin slippers she was used to, but boots meant for walking on cobblestones. "Put these on. Silk is for dancing, cotton is for walking, and you have a very long way to go." Clara looked at the boots, then at her cotton sleeves. She realized that the transition was a shedding of a cocoon. The Gilded Age had been a dream of silk, but the reality of the 1890s was made of iron, coal, and cotton. As she stood up, her cotton skirts hissing, not with the elegant rustle of silk, but with a sharp, determined sound. She tied the sturdy boots. She smoothed her hair, which was no longer curled by a professional, but pulled back in a practical knot. The heiress was dead. The woman remained. As she walked toward the kitchen to help her mother boil water on a stove they barely knew how to operate, Clara felt a new sensation. It wasn't the lightness of silk. It was the weight of herself. It was the ready-to-wear reality. And though it was cold, and though it was hard, it was finally, undeniably, real. The silk was gone. The cotton was here. And for the first time, Clara Huntington was ready to work. One final, desperate attempt to reclaim status before the lights go out. The invitation had arrived like a ghost from a past life. It was the Waldorf Astoria's annual charity gala, the most exclusive event of the winter season. For the Huntingtons, who were now living in a world of ready-to-wear cotton and dwindling hopes, the card was more than an invitation, it was a lifeline. In Althea's mind, if they could just walk across that ballroom floor one more time, if they could secure one last conversation with a powerful financier, perhaps the ruin could be reversed. "We are going," Althea said, her voice trembling with a feverish intensity. She was holding her last remaining asset, a gown of midnight black velvet that had been hidden in a trunk during the auction. "One night, Clara, one night to remind them who we are before the bank changes the locks for good." "Could we not sell the gown?" Clara argued, looking at their cramped temporary quarters. "We don't even have a carriage. We would be arriving as beggars at the gates of a kingdom." "Then we shall hire a carriage with the last of the kitchen silver," Althea cried. "The world is a stage, Clara, and the curtain hasn't fallen until we say it has."
The transformation was painful. To prepare for the gala, Clara and Althea had to perform a ritual of deception. They used flour to whiten their opera gloves where the fabric had yellowed. They used soot from the fireplace to hide the scuffs on their shoes. Clara's jewelry consisted of paste replicas, glass masquerading as diamonds, a fitting metaphor for their entire existence. When they arrived at the Waldorf Astoria, the sheer brilliance of the electric lights was blinding. The hotel was a palace of marble and gold, a cathedral of the very excess that had destroyed them. As they stepped into the foyer, the familiar scent of expensive cigars and French lilies washed over them. For a moment, Clara felt the old magic return. The rustle of her velvet skirts against the marble floor sounded like power. But then she saw the eyes. The 400 were already there. The whispers didn't stop when the Huntingtons entered. They intensified. "Look at the neck," a woman whispered loud enough for Clara to hear. "Those aren't the Huntington emeralds. That's glass. They've come to scavenge." The gala was a gauntlet of social death. Althea moved toward a group of bankers' wives, her smile a fixed, frozen mask. "Mrs. Belmont, how lovely to see you. I was just telling Clara that we must have you over to the new estate once the renovations are complete." Mrs. Belmont didn't even turn her head. She adjusted her diamond-encrusted lorgnette and spoke to her husband. "Richard, do remind me to tell the butler that we are no longer accepting calling cards from temporary addresses." The rejection was surgical. It was the last waltz, but the Huntingtons were dancing with ghosts. Clara stood by the punch bowl, her glass of champagne feeling like lead. She saw the Duke of Southshire across the room. He was with a new girl, a daughter of a Chicago meatpacking magnate. Her dress was louder, her diamonds were bigger, and her dowry was intact. He caught Clara's eye for a fraction of a second. Then he looked away as if she were a smudge of soot on a white wall. "The music is beautiful tonight," a familiar voice said. Arthur Vance was standing behind her. He wasn't dressed in the finery of the others. He wore a plain black tuxedo that had seen better years. "Why are you here, Arthur?" Clara asked, her voice cracking. "To watch us drown in public?" He said, "I'm here to take you home before the lights go out. Look at your mother, Clara. She's fighting a war that was lost months ago. This room doesn't belong to you anymore. These people, they aren't your peers. They are your creditors." "I wanted one last night," Clara whispered, looking at the glittering chandeliers. "One last night where I didn't feel the weight of the cotton." "The velvet is a lie, Clara," Vance said, taking her hand. His touch was warm and real, a stark contrast to the cold glass jewelry she wore. "The Waldorf is a dream, the street is the reality, and the street is where your life is waiting for you." Suddenly, the music stopped. The head of the gala committee stepped onto the dais. It was time for the honorary toast. Usually, the Huntington name would have been the first called. "To the families who built this city," the man announced, his voice booming. He listed the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Whitneys. He reached the end of the list. He paused, his eyes skating over Althea Huntington, who stood hopeful and upright in the center of the floor. He closed the ledger. "To the survivors of the panic, may our fortunes remain as solid as the stones of this hotel." The name Huntington was never spoken. They had been officially erased. The lights in the ballroom didn't actually go out, but for Clara, the world turned gray. She watched her mother's shoulders finally slump. The last waltz was over, and they hadn't even been invited to the dance floor. They left the Waldorf Astoria not in a private carriage, but on foot. They walked out of the gold-leafed doors and into the biting New York wind. The transition from the warmth of the ballroom to the cold of the street was a physical shock. Althea stumbled, her black velvet skirts dragging in the slush of the gutter. "My shoes," Mother whispered, looking down at the soot-stained silk. "They're ruined." "It's okay, Mother," Clara said, wrapping her arm around her mother's waist. "We don't need them anymore." As they walked away from the Waldorf, Clara looked back one last time. The hotel looked like a glowing mountain of gold, unreachable and indifferent. Inside, the music resumed, a faint, tinny sound in the distance. The Huntington era was not just over, it was forgotten. The lights were still on for the rest of the world, but for the Gilded Age heiresses, the darkness had finally arrived. "What now, Clara?" Althea asked as they reached their cramped apartment building. "Now," Clara said, looking at her rough, reddened hands, "we stop pretending. We go inside, we take off the velvet, and we figure out how to earn our bread." The last waltz had been a failure of status, but a victory of truth. The lights were out, the masks were off, and for the first time, Clara Huntington didn't care what the 400 thought of her. She was cold, she was poor, and she was finally, dangerously free.
leaving the mansion for a cramped apartment in a less fashionable zip code. The exit was not a grand procession, it was a theft in the night. In the early hours of a Tuesday morning, before the city's gossip columnists could sharpen their pens, the Huntingtons left Fifth Avenue. They did not leave in a carriage, they left in a hired drayage wagon, sitting atop the few trunks the law had allowed them to keep. As the limestone towers of their former home faded into the gray mist of the Hudson, Clara felt a sudden sharp snap in her chest. It was the sound of the umbilical cord to her old life finally severed. Their destination was not a zip code the elite recognized. They moved south and east, away from the wide boulevards and toward the cramped, soot-stained streets of the Lower East Side. Here, the air did not smell of lilies. It smelled of coal dust, boiled cabbage, and the unwashed sweat of 1,000 striving souls. The boarding house was a narrow brownstone that had seen better decades. The front steps were chipped, and the foyer was a dim tunnel that smelled of floor wax and old tobacco. The apartment was actually 2 small rooms on the 4th floor, tucked under the eaves where the ceiling slanted so sharply that Silas had to duck his head to reach the window. "Is this it?" Althea whispered. She stood in the center of the room, her gloved hands hovering as if afraid to touch the peeling floral wallpaper. "Where is the dressing room? Where are the servants' quarters?" "Mother," Clara said, her voice sounding flat in the small space, "we are the servants now. There is no one else." In the mansion, space was a weapon, vast, echoing halls designed to make a person feel small but significant. In the boarding house, space was a commodity. Every square inch had to be fought for. Their trunks served as tables, their coats served as extra blankets, and the single wash basin was a far cry from the marble tubs of Fifth Avenue.
The broken dreams weren't just about the money, they were about the loss of privacy. In their old life, silence was a given. Here, the walls were as thin as parchment. Through the floorboards, they could hear the rhythmic thumping of a tailor's sewing machine, and through the walls, they heard the muffled arguments of a young couple and the crying of an infant. Silas Huntington sat by the single grimy window for hours, watching the elevated train rattle past. The man who had once owned the rails was now vibrating with their movement in a room he barely rented. "I can hear them, Clara," he said one evening, his eyes fixed on the distance. "The men I stepped on to get to the top. I can hear them laughing in the whistle of the engine." "Don't, Father," Clara pleaded. She was trying to mend a tear in her cotton skirt by the light of a single sputtering tallow candle. "The past is a ghost. We have to live in the present." "The present is a grave, Clara. I've buried you in a room no bigger than a coffin." The social transition was even more brutal than the physical one. Clara had to learn the rules of the poor. She learned how to haggle with the grocer for day-old bread, and she learned how to ignore the stares of the other boarders who looked at her faded silk ribbons with a mixture of mockery and pity. One afternoon, she encountered the landlady, Mrs. Higgins, a woman with skin like cured leather and a heart made of cold iron. "Rent's due on Saturday, Miss Huntington," the woman said, leaning against the doorframe with a wet rag in her hand. "No letters of intent here, no railroad bonds, just hard, cold cash, or you'll find your trunks on the sidewalk by sunset." "We understand, Mrs. Higgins," Clara replied, her chin held high. "Do you? Because I've seen your kind before. You think this is a temporary setback. You think the Duke is coming for you. Let me tell you, the Duke ain't coming. The only thing coming is the winter, and coal costs 4 cents a bucket. You'd do well to find a job before the frost hits." The word job hung in the air like a dirty rag. For a Huntington, work was something other people did. It was the ultimate taboo, the final admission that the Gilded Age was dead. That night, Clara stood on the fire escape, looking out over the jagged skyline of the city.
The lights of Fifth Avenue were a distant amber glow on the horizon. From here, they looked like stars, beautiful, cold, and completely unreachable. Beneath her, the street was a chaos of noise and life. It was ugly, it was loud, and it was honest. She realized that the broken dreams were only broken because they were made of glass. The dream of being a duchess, the dream of the 400, those were the illusions. The reality was the cold iron of the fire escape under her hands and the need to earn the next bucket of coal. She went back inside and saw her mother, Althea, sitting on the edge of the sagging bed, still wearing her lace veil as if it could protect her from the smell of the room. "We are going to be okay, Mother," Clara said, though she didn't believe it yet. "We are in a boarding house, Clara," Althea replied, her voice a hollow echo. "The Huntingtons do not live in boarding houses. We are just visiting, aren't we?" Clara didn't answer. She blew out the candle, plunging the cramped room into darkness. The less fashionable zip code was now their world. The mansion was gone, the status was gone, and as the sounds of the city roared outside their window, Clara Huntington realized that the hardest part of falling wasn't the landing, it was the realization that the world kept spinning even after you were gone. The dreams were broken, but for the first time, Clara wasn't dreaming. She was wide awake, and the morning was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. She walked home in the dark, her veil pulled tight against the biting wind. As she passed a newsstand, she saw a headline in the social register. "The season opens, a glittering debut at the Sherry Netherland." A year ago, that would have been her. She would have been the one in the silk, the one being toasted, the one whose biggest worry was the fit of a glove. Now, she was the woman who made the lining of the coat the debutante's father would wear. She reached the boarding house and climbed the 4 flights of stairs. Her mother was waiting in the dark to save on oil. "Where have you been, Clara?" Althea asked, her voice trembling. "I was so frightened. I thought perhaps you had gone to see a lawyer, or perhaps the Duke had sent word." Clara walked to the table and let the coins fall one by one. Clink, clink, clink. "The Duke is a ghost, Mother," Clara said, her voice echoing in the small room. "This is our reality. I worked today. I stitched coats for men who wouldn't look at us in the street." Althea let out a strangled cry, covering her mouth with her hand. You took a job? A common job? Clara, the shame, if anyone found out." "There is no one left to find out, Mother," Clara said, taking off her hat and the heavy black veil. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair was disheveled, and her hands were ruined. "The shame isn't in the work. The shame was in the lie. I earned this. For the first time in my life, I am not a debt. I am a resource." That night, as she lay on her thin pallet, Clara Huntington didn't dream of ballrooms. She dreamed of the rhythm of the machine. Stitch, snip, pull, repeat. The taboo was shattered. The gilded girl was buried under the soot of the Bowery, and in her place, a working woman was beginning to rise. The veil was off, and though the world was darker, the sight was finally clear. Realizing who stays and who vanishes when the bank accounts are empty. The Gilded Age was built on a foundation of fair-weather friendships. In the halls of Fifth Avenue, loyalty was a currency, and like any currency, it was subject to inflation and collapse. When the Huntingtons' coffers were overflowing, the world was their stage. But when the gold vanished, the audience did not just leave, they acted as if the performers had never existed. For Clara Huntington, the lesson of friends of fortune was the most painful of all. It was a bitter December evening. Clara was walking home from the garment factory, her hands tucked into the thin sleeves of her wool coat. As she passed the entrance of the Delmonico's, a restaurant where she had once celebrated her 18th birthday, the doors swung open. A group of young women, wrapped in sables and laughing under their feathered hats, spilled out onto the sidewalk. They were her circle. These were the girls who had whispered secrets in her ear during garden parties, the girls who had promised to be her bridesmaids. "Eleanor," Clara called out, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. The girl in the center, Eleanor Vanderbilt Smith, stopped. She looked at Clara, at her red, chapped hands, her faded cotton scarf, and the smudge of soot on her cheek. For a heartbeat there was a flicker of recognition, but then a mask of cold indifference descended. "I'm sorry, do I know you, my good woman? I'm afraid I don't carry change for the poor." The girls behind her giggled, pulling their furs tighter as they stepped into their heated carriage. They didn't see Clara, they saw a ghost they wanted to bury. As the carriage pulled away, splashing freezing slush onto Clara's boots, she realized the truth. Their friendship had been an investment, and now that she was bankrupt, she was a liability they could no longer afford. The vanishing was total. The dozens of floral arrangements that used to arrive on her birthday replaced by silence. The letters of sympathy, they never came. Instead, Clara found herself living in a world where the only people who stayed were the ones she had once considered unimportant. One evening, back at the cramped boarding house, a knock came to the door. Clara opened it to find a woman standing in the dim hallway. It was Mary, her mother's former lady's maid, the woman Althea had dismissed without pay when the crash first hit. Mary was wearing a simple, worn cloak and carried a small basket covered with a clean cloth. "Mary?" Clara whispered. "Why are you here? We have nothing to give you." "I didn't come for what you have, Miss Clara," Mary said, stepping into the room. She placed the basket on the table. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of homemade jam. "I heard about your father. I heard you were working the machines in the Bowery. I thought a bit of kindness might go further than a paycheck today." Clara stared at the bread. This woman, whom they had treated as a shadow for years, was the only one who had come. "Why?" Clara asked, her voice cracking. "After how we treated you?" "Because, Miss Clara," Mary said gently, "I know what it's like to be hungry. Your friends uptown, they don't know what a stomach growl sounds like. They only love the reflection of their own wealth in your eyes. Now that the mirror is broken, they've gone to find a new one." The final revelation of Friends of Fortune came from Arthur Vance. He had become a constant, quiet presence in her new life. He didn't bring diamonds, he brought coal for their small stove. He didn't bring gossip, he brought books and news of the world. One night, as they sat on the fire escape watching the snow fall over the tenements, Clara asked him, "Why did you stay, Arthur? You could be at the Waldorf tonight. You could be with people who still have names." Vance smiled, a sad, honest smile. "I never liked the 400, Clara. They are a symphony of echoes. They only exist because of the things they own. But you, I wanted to see what was left when the gold was scraped away." "And what did you find?" "I found a woman who is far more interesting than an heiress," he said, taking her hand. His skin was rough, just like hers. "The friends of fortune are gone, because they were never your friends. They were friends of the Huntington title. But the people who are here, Mary, your father's old clerk, me, we are friends of Clara." Clara looked at the dark, crowded streets below. The Gilded Age was a memory now, a distant, shimmering dream that felt increasingly unreal. She realized that poverty had given her something that wealth never could, the ability to see the hearts of men. The bank accounts were empty, the mansion was gone, the silk was replaced by cotton. But as she sat in the cold, holding Arthur's hand and smelling the fresh bread from Mary's basket, she knew she was richer than she had ever been on Fifth Avenue. The friends of fortune had vanished, but the friends of the soul remained.
and in the harsh, honest light of the working world, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. The lesson was learned. The circle was small, but for the first time in her life, it was real.
Navigating bankruptcy courts and the harsh laws of the 19th century. In the Gilded Age, the law was not a shield for the fallen, it was a grinder. For the Huntingtons, the transition from the ballroom to the boarding house was only the beginning of the humiliation. The true death of their status occurred in the gray, windowless chambers of the New York Bankruptcy Court. Here, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap ink, and the sour breath of men who had spent their lives tallying the failures of others. Clara stood beside her father in a hallway that felt like a limestone tomb. Silas Huntington, once a titan who dictated terms to Congress, was now just a number on a docket. He held a stack of legal papers, the labyrinth, a dizzying array of liens, summonses, and affidavits that seemed designed to strip a man not just of his money, but of his very name. "The laws of 1893 are not written for mercy, Clara," Silas whispered. His voice was a rasp, his strength sapped by months of litigation. "They are written for the creditors. To the court, I am not a person. I am a collection of bad debts and broken promises." The courtroom was a theater of cold precision. The judge, a man named Henderson with a face like a dried apple, sat high above the room. He did not look at the people, he looked at the ledgers. In the 19th century, bankruptcy was often treated as a moral failing, a sin against the god of commerce. Case number 412, the matter of the Huntington Railway Estate. The opposing counsel, a man representing a consortium of banks, stood up. He was sharp, dressed in a suit that cost more than Clara's annual factory wages. He spoke with a clinical cruelty. "Your Honor," the opposing counsel began, "we find that the debtor, Silas Huntington, has attempted to shield assets, specifically a collection of jewelry and personal effects, from the reach of the court. We move for a total attachment of all family property, including the personal residence of the daughter and the wife." Clara felt a surge of cold fire in her chest. She stepped forward, ignoring the frantic tug on her sleeve from their own overworked, underpaid attorney. "Your Honor," Clara's voice rang out, startling the room. "The assets he speaks of were sold to pay the wages of the men who kept that house standing. Is it a crime in this city to pay a servant before a bank?" Gavel thud. "Silence, Miss Huntington," the judge barked, not looking up. "This is a court of law, not a sentimental stage. The law is clear. The debt follows the blood. If the father cannot pay, the family's future is the collateral." The labyrinth was designed to be inescapable. Day after day, Clara and Silas navigated the maze of the courthouse. They learned the harsh laws of the era, laws where a woman had no standing to protect her own inheritance if her father or husband had signed it away. They faced creditors' meetings, where men who had once begged for an invitation to their balls now sat in a circle, demanding to know the value of Althea's silver-backed brushes and Clara's childhood books. "The inventory is incomplete," one creditor shouted, slamming a fist on the table. "Where are the Huntington emeralds? We know they existed. We saw them at the masquerade." Clara looked at the man. He was a banker who had once toasted her health with vintage champagne. Now his eyes were full of a predatory hunger. "The emeralds are gone," Clara said, her voice steady. "They have been converted into bread and coal. If you want them, you'll have to find the people who ate the bread." The room went silent. It was a moment of stark, ugly truth. The law didn't care about bread, it cared about the emeralds. To the court, the Huntington family was merely a liquidation event. The final blow of the legal labyrinth came in the form of a general assignment. It was a document that required Silas to sign away everything, not just what he owned, but any potential future earnings for the next 10 years. It was a form of financial indentured servitude.
In the dim light of the lawyer's office, Silas picked up the pen. His hand shook. For a man who had signed the checks that built the transcontinental rails, this was the final defeat. "If I sign this, Clara, you will never have a dowry. You will never have a name that means anything but bankrupt." "Sign it, Father," Clara said, placing her hand over his. "The name hasn't protected us. The law hasn't protected us. Let them have the paper. They can't have the soul." As the ink dried on the parchment, Clara felt a strange sense of closure. The labyrinth had been navigated. They had been stripped of their vanity, their property, and their legal standing. They were now, in the eyes of the law, non-entities. They walked out of the courthouse and into the gray New York rain. The lawyers remained inside, arguing over the scraps. The 400 were miles away, safely tucked behind their own legal walls. But Clara felt a sudden lightness. The harsh laws had done their worst. They had taken everything that could be measured in gold. "What now, Clara?" Silas asked, leaning on his cane. "Now," Clara said, looking at the towering courthouse one last time, "we are outside the maze. We owe the world nothing. We are poor, but for the first time in my life, we don't belong to the banks." The legal labyrinth was behind them. The Gilded Age was a closed book, and as she helped her father down the stairs, Clara realized that while the law could take their past, it had no jurisdiction over their future. They were finally, legally, and beautifully, nothing.
The turning point came when Arthur Vance visited her at the factory gates. He didn't bring roses or poetry. He brought a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. "I've seen how you watch the other women, Clara," he said, his eyes reflecting the gaslight of the street. "You see the injustice of the floor, the way the foreman cheats the girls of their minutes. You have a voice that the 400 never allowed you to use. Why not use it now?" Clara took the notebook. That night, by the light of a single tallow candle, she began to write. She wrote about the shoddy dust in the lungs of the seamstresses. She wrote about the legal labyrinth that protected the rich and crushed the poor. As she wrote, she felt a surge of purpose that no ballroom toast could ever provide. Her worth was no longer tied to what she owned, but to what she could do for those who had even less than she did. "I am not a broken thing," Clara realized, her pen scratching rhythmically against the paper. "I am a bridge. I have seen the heights of the Gilded Age and the depths of the tenements. I am the only one who can tell the truth about both." The resilience in the ruins was not a loud, heroic thing. It was the way she held her father's hand when he cried for his lost railroads. It was the way she bargained with the grocer for an extra onion to make the stew stretch further.